He was by most accounts considered the father of the science fiction genre. Jules Verne is one of the most translated authors in the world and was an early pioneer in science fiction literature. He's one of my favorite classic novel writers and is known for his unique avant-garde or experimental take on the classic adventure novel. While his reputation in the West was quite remarkably tarnished, often being associated as a genre writer or a children's book author, his legacy and work on scientific literature has since been improved. He is best remembered for adventure novels like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and Around the World in 80 Days. Some books I can review and explore in more detail in subsequent videos. So who was Jules Verne really? In 1828, Verne was born in the French port city of Nantes. He was born to a well-to-do family with a father that was an attorney and a mother who came from a long line of navigators and ship owners. At this coastal area of France, Verne's young mind was fascinated by the sea vessels that came and went through the ports and had a vivid imagination for the exploration of our world, imagining the travel and adventure that would await. Verne recalled in a memoir that he was deeply fascinated by observing the vessels traversing river canals. He fondly recalled memories of playing the game of goose with his uncle who had traveled around the world as a ship owner. He would later memorialize him in some of his works of short fiction. At the age of 6, he was sent to a boarding school that was taught by a widow of a naval captain that had been lost at sea for 30-some years. She would apparently tell stories of how he would one day return in much the same manner as Robinson Crusoe in the same castaway story trope. While attending the school, Verne would often write short stories with these traveling adventures in mind. His father, however, had other plans for him, and he was promptly sent to law school to follow in his father's footsteps. While Verne was writing long works of literature in the style of contemporary French writers at the age of 19, his father assumed that being the oldest child he would not waste his time and talent in the burgeoning literary world, but would instead inherit his family law firm. After completing his studies for the first year of law school, Verne returned to Nantes to seek his father's help in the second year. When he returned, he encountered a young woman that he fell madly in love with, and unsurprisingly sent swarmy poems to. The young lady seemed to at one point reciprocate to those feelings, but her family disapproved of the idea of her marrying a young student with an uncertain disposition in life. Instead, she was married to a much wealthier landowner who was 10 years her senior. This devastated Verne, and he would write his frustrations to his mother in great length, and he would often include the trope of women forced into marriages in his novels. He even carried a chip on his shoulder over his city in general, with a general disgust for Nantes. When he returned to law school, which was based in Paris, the French Revolution of 1848 was taking place, which saw a second French Republic being constructed, and tension rising. During this time he spent in Paris, Napoleon III became the new republic's president, and the bombardment of the city proper was described by Verne to his family by letter as chaotic, but assured them that all was going well. During his time in school, Verne was able to use connections in his family to network with writers and playwrights in the city, and he would often attend these literary salons, which he frequented through the convenience of one of his uncles. While he fervently studied for his legal exams, he actively frequented the literary salons and continued his literary writings, becoming interested in theater, with Victor Hugo being one of his most profound influences. It was during this time that Verne struggled with what would become a lifelong battle with stomach cramps, which it is theorized might have been caused by colitis, or the recent outbreak of cholera in 1849. In the 1850s, Verne would also suffer a series of facial paralysis attacks, which were later discovered to be due to ear inflammation. The same year, Verne was initially forced to join the French military, but he was spared from participating due to the sortition process. In January the next year, Verne had finally graduated from law school. Through his connections to the literary salon, Verne met Alexandre Dumas' son, who collaborated on a play that was soon adapted to the theater in Paris. In 1851, the same year, Verne met Pierre-Michel François Chevalier when he returned to Nantes, who was the editor of a magazine focused on geography, history, science, and technology, and wanted these themes conveyed through short fictional stories. Because Verne was a natural fit for writing and had a keen interest in geography, he offered some early works of his bibliography, including A Voyage in a Balloon, published in 1851. This story was an early template for many of Verne's later works, having the same elements of adventure, travel themes, and detailed historical research. Later on, Verne was reintroduced to the theater by Alexandre Dumas Fay, Dumas' son, who introduced him to Jules Sylvestre, who had taken over the Paris theater as a stage director and who offered Verne a secretarial job in the theater for little to no pay. Verne accepted the offer and began producing several comedic operas while contributing to his work in Nantes. During much of this time, Verne's father tried to convince Verne to abandon this fleeting passion of his and start work as a lawyer. This all reached a turning point when Verne was pressured in 1852 by his father to accept an offer of taking over his Nantes law firm. Now more independent and aware of his true calling, Verne argued that only true success for him would be found in the literary world. He refused his father's offer and continued pursuing his own connections in the literary circle, writing to his father, "Am I not right to follow my own instincts? It's because I know who I am that I realize what I can be one day." Verne would often spend much of his time in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, often researching for his stories and continuing his passion for knowledge regarding scientific discoveries and advancement in geographic research. During this time, Verne met an explorer and geographer, Jacques Arago, who frequently traveled in spite of his blindness. Arago's storytelling recounting his travels inspired Verne to explore the emerging genre of travel writing. Verne published various articles and travel adventure stories that were sometimes not even credited to him. Eventually, Verne and his publisher had a falling out in 1856, which led to Verne refusing to contribute to the magazine again. Such was his grudge against the owner that when Pierre Michel François Chevalier passed away, Verne eventually contributed more works of fiction under the new editorial team. While contributing to this magazine, Verne was said to have thought of inventing a unique kind of novel, the novel of science, or what we would commonly refer to today as science fiction. Meanwhile, Jules Sylvestre, his stage director, colleague, and boss, had passed away of cholera, which was causing an outbreak in France at the time. Verne continued on and contributed by writing plays and musical comedies after Sylvestre's death. In 1856, while arriving at a wedding of his friend, Verne became acquainted with the bride's family, becoming attracted to her sister, who was a 26-year-old widow with 2 children at the time. In order to secure her love and his financial security, Verne accepted the offer from her brother of becoming a broker for his business. Verne's father accepted his request for approval, and with his financial security in place, he was accepted by her family and married in January the next year. Leaving his work at the theater in the rear-view mirror, Verne set aside mornings to write and worked his full-time job as an associate broker. He continued his involvement with literary salons and frequented the bibliothèque to research scientific and geographic topics, which he would transcribe in summaries on note cards. Verne had the opportunity presented to him to experience a voyage at sea during this time, and these moments of travel inspired some of his works of fiction. In fact, one of his travels prevented him from witnessing the birth of his own biological son, Michel. In 1862, Verne met through one of his many connections a man named Pierre-Jules Hetzel, who was a publisher. He found that Verne and his highly researched adventure stories were a good fit for his ventures. Verne submitted a manuscript of a novel involving hot air balloon travel, which was received well. Hetzel, who had published many other famous French authors at the time, was planning to promote a magazine that would combine fiction with scientific research, which suited Verne well. With revisions from Hetzel, Verne finally completed the novel 5 Weeks in a Balloon, partially based on the manuscript Verne submitted, which was quickly published in Hetzel's magazine. To secure his standing in the magazine of education and recreation, Verne was given a contract that stipulated that Verne would give the publisher 3 novels per year, which Hetzel would buy for a fee. Verne accepted this stipulation, and many of his works were adopted in serialized form. After publishing The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, Verne was tasked with writing a novel sequence, a collection of novels and short stories called Extraordinary Voyages that would outline all the geographical, geological, physical, and astronomical knowledge amassed by modern science, and to recount in an entertaining and picturesque format that is his own the history of the universe. Hetzel had a somewhat broad influence over Verne and would set a family-friendly tone and censor his writing to prevent negative negative submersive elements, including death and a pessimistic attitude toward the future, to appear in what was considered a family magazine. In 1869, this relationship would change as publisher and writer would clash over 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea over the titular character Captain Nemo. Verne originally created Nemo as a Polish scientist who was seeking vengeance primarily toward Russians who had murdered his family in the January uprising. Hetzel, not wanting to limit himself from the lucrative Russian market, sought to change Nemo's origin and motives as a proponent against the international slave trade. To compromise, Verne decided to keep Nemo's origins unclear. This led to Verne making creative decisions on his own, often ignoring Hetzel's complaints unless forced to reconsider them. Of the works he published in Extraordinary Voyages, Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, and From the Earth to the Moon were some of his best known and most well received. At this point, Verne had finally achieved something he had strived to complete most of his life, a career in writing about scientific travel literature that could actually provide for his living. His continued involvement in theater is what, for the most part, provided him the most financial reward, apparently, as some of his stage adaptations proved to be popular and financially rewarding. With his wealth accumulating and his fame rising, Verne bought a boat which he named Saint Michel, and he used this sailing vessel to travel around Europe. In his later years, he began publishing darker works, especially after the deaths of his mother and Hetzel, who both died the same year. Apparently, on March 9, Verne was shot at twice by his 26-year-old nephew Gaston, which thankfully spared his life but gave him a permanent limp in his limb. His nephew was sent to a mental asylum while the incident was silenced in the media. In his later years, he became politically active and even was elected at the local level as a town councilor in Amiens, his town place. On March 24, 1905, Jules Verne became ill with his chronic battle with diabetes and problems involving a stroke and died in his home in Amiens. His great-grandson discovered in 1989 a dystopian future unpublished novel called Paris in the 20th Century that allegedly foreshadowed many inventions and concepts of the future, including skyscrapers, cars with internal combustion engines, electric city lights, amongst other things. It is said that on many fronts, Verne was ahead of his times, and perhaps his time learning from scientific journals amplified this. Verne's legacy continues to make an impact today. While he became commercially successful, Verne was never honored for his contribution to French literature and was derided by some critics as too much of a genre writer who wasn't worthy of academic study. In the 1960s and 70s, Verne became more and more recognized as a literary icon, and his publications gained more respect and appreciation from the French public, especially after his work became inducted into French literary canon in many universities. Unfortunately, Jules Verne's appreciation in the English-speaking world has been more gradual. In the UK and the US, Verne's work was marketed as children's novels and were significantly altered to appeal to a younger audience. Thus, most of his work has been lost in translation and promoted in Hollywood movies with a loose basis on his actual storytelling. In America as well, there became a fascination with him being a seemingly prophetic voice of science, predicting technological advancements that were far ahead of his time. Instead, he was merely making connections with scientific developments at the time and expounding on what he had read in scientific journals, and while these references in his novels are quite extraordinary, it is overanalyzed perhaps. Verne's exploration adventures that often imagined exploring the unknowns of our world at the time inspired many deep-sea explorers to venture in the unknown surfaces of our world, including the submarine designer Simon Lake, who exclaimed that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was a big influence to him, and that Jules Verne was, in a sense, the director general of my life. Verne's work From the Earth to the Moon inspired many of the Apollo 8 team, crediting him by saying, in a very real sense, Jules Verne is one of the pioneers of the space age. Various men of science and explorers who have made discoveries in space, in caverns and caves, in the Arctic and in the deep sea have all credited Jules Verne as their biggest inspirations. Many contributors to more modern literature attribute Verne as an inspiration to their writings, some of which include the likes of J.R.R. Tolkien, who had used parallels in some of his stories to the Journey to the Center of the Earth novel. Verne is often cited as an influence to the steampunk genre, which emphasized a type of science fiction based on a 19th century technology. Because of his great influence on literature and scientific study, Verne's influence was named by Ray Bradbury in this way: "We are all, in one way or another, the children of Jules Verne."